Go. Hello, my name is Isa.
My name is Clarice.
And my name is Kim Soo.
And this is our presentation for EDET 112 Assignment 2. For this assignment, the principle that we chose from the early years learning framework was respect for diversity. The theories that we chose to discuss in regard to this principle were Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory for historical understandings of childhood learning and pedagogy, and postmodern theory for contemporary understandings of childhood learning and pedagogy. Finally, we directly compare the two and critically reflect on the effects they have had on practice.
So now let's move to historical understanding of childhood learning and pedagogies. So first I'm gonna mention about historical context. So in the past, educators and parents view children development differently. Children were normally viewed as a universal development expectation where there were not many theories, practices, and pedagogies to support their early learning for development. Children were expected to develop in similar pathway as other children. According to Walkanova in 2014, childhood of children have been understood differently across time and culture. Children often work alongside adults in the past. Over time, people began to change their perspective by understanding children's needs, children's rights, and the needed educational experience in their childhood. Through her discussion, it demonstrated that children is shaped through social, cultural, and historical context rather than norms. This challenge assumed that childhood was a universal experience shared by all children. Instead, Walkanowa discussion highlight that children's experience vary according to the cultural, social, and historical environments in which they live, providing an important foundation for understanding diversity in early childhood education. Aligning with Bronfenbrenner ecological theory, demonstrating how children's development is influenced by multiple factors in the surrounding environment, including family, culture, community, belief, society, and experiences. Overall, this perspective highlights the importance of diversity in children's experience in their early age. Now let's move to Bronfenbrenner ecological theory. Bronfenbrenner ecological theory represents an understanding of how children develop within environmental systems. He believed that children would not learn or develop through isolation. However, they are developed and learn through direct relationship and interaction with the surrounding environment. Bronfenbrenner proposed a series of interconnected environmental systems that influence children's development, ranging from immediate relationships to broader cultural and societal influences. Bronfenbrenner's ecological perspective highlights the interconnected relationship between children and their environments, recognizing that development is shaped by social, cultural context. He proposed that children's development occur within a series of interconnected environmental systems, including immediate relationships such as family, educator, and peer, as well as broader influences like community, culture, social value, and public policy. Through this understanding, educators in early childhood settings started to set children as active participants who interact with and are shaped by their environment rather than passive recipients of these influences. A significant contribution of Bronfenbrenner theory was the recognition of children's experiences according to environments in which they live, which is different from historical perspective where people assume that childhood follow a universal pathway for all children. This represented a significant shift from the understanding of childhood that focused on universal development pathway. Bronfenbrenner recognized that children's development is influenced by diverse family structure, cultural identity, and community context, meaning that development cannot be understood in the same way for every child. This perspective is particularly relevant to the EYLS, the principle of respect for diversity. By recognizing that children's development is shaped by their unique family, cultural, and community context, Bronfenbrenner theories encourage educators to understand and value children's diverse identity and experiences. For example, children from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds may bring different ways of knowing, learning, and communicating into early childhood setting. However, while Bronfenbrenner theory acknowledged the importance of culture and context, contemporary researchers argue that it provides limited discussion of issues such as power, discrimination, social inequality, and intersectionality. These areas are explored more explicitly in contemporary approaches, which move beyond recognizing diversity to actively promoting inclusive and equity for all children and family. Bronfenbrenner and the so now let's move to the next part, which is the principle. Which is the principle of respect for diversity. So Bronfenbrenner ecological system theory provides an important foundation for understanding the principle of respect for diversity. The principle recognizes that children bring diverse identities, experiences, language, culture, and way of knowing into early childhood setting. Similarly, Bronfenbrenner argued that children develop is shaped by the unique social and cultural environment in which they live. From this perspective, diversity is not viewed as a challenge that children must overcome. Instead, children's family background, cultural tradition, language, and community experiences are recognized as important influences on learning and development. This understanding encourages educators to move away from one-size-fits-all approaches and instead respond to the individual strengths, needs, and identity of each child. Contemporary early childhood practices extend Bronfenbrenner's idea through the EYLF principle of respect for diversity. Educators are expected to create inclusive learning environment where all children feel a sense of belonging and where different culture, language, and family structure are valued and represented. According to McNaughton and Hughes in 2007, argued that respecting diversity requires more than simply celebrating cultural festival or acknowledging the difference. Educators must actively embed inclusive practices within the curriculum and challenge approaches that may exclude children from diverse backgrounds. This highlights a key difference between Bronfenbrenner's theories and contemporary practice. While Bronfenbrenner explained how culture and context influence development, contemporary frameworks such as EYLF place greater emphasis on actively promoting inclusive, equity, and social justice. Therefore, Bronfenbrenner theory remains highly relevant in early childhood education because it encourages educators to understand the diverse context that shape children's life. However, contemporary approaches build on this foundation by emphasizing the educator's responsibility to create equitable and culturally responsive learning environment for all children and family. Bronfenbrenner ecological system theory represents an important shift in historical understanding of childhood because it recognizes that children's development is influenced by family, culture, community, and broader social context. This challenged earlier assumption that childhood follows a universal development pathway. However, contemporary perspectives have extended Bronfenbrenner's idea even further. While Bronfenbrenner focused on explaining how environmental systems influence children's development, contemporary theories such as postmodernism question whether there is a single correct way of understanding childhood, learning, or development. This represents a significant shift in thought and practice. Rather than viewing children's experience against universal development expectation, contemporary perspective recognize that children bring diverse identity, experience, culture, and way of knowing into educational setting. Diversity in view as a strength rather than different that need to be accommodated. These changing understanding have influenced early childhood practice by encouraging educators to move beyond recognizing diversity and actively creating inclusive, equitable, and culturally responsive learning environment. The next section will explore how postmodern perspectives have further challenged traditional understanding of how childhood and contributed to contemporary approaches to diversity in early childhood setting.
The theory we have chosen for the contemporary understandings of childhood, learning, and pedagogy is postmodern theory. Postmodern theories and perspectives challenge common assumptions, modern truths, and the privileging of certain positions. Postmodern theory believes that just because something has been done a certain way for a long time, it doesn't mean that is the only way or best way to do it, or that just because one belief has been commonly held as truth for a long time, it doesn't mean that belief is true or that it is the only one that is true. Postmodern perspectives challenge the concept of dichotomies or the existence of a right or wrong answer to a situation or question, such as the idea of appropriate and inappropriate behaviors. One such example of a dichotomy may be how slurping your food is considered rude in many Western societies, but is considered a sign of enjoying the food and is considered normal or even polite in many Eastern societies. Postmodern theory believes that there are many truths, not just one. These truths are the many ways of thinking about and viewing the world and are influenced by people's experiences and patterns of learning and behaving. Therefore, postmodern perspectives believe that all understandings of the world are equally valuable and true, no matter how different they may be to each other and no matter how many people hold this specific understanding. In regard to understandings of childhood, learning, and pedagogy, this means that postmodern theory believes that there is no one correct way to teach children or one correct way for children to learn. It places equal value on all experiences and knowledge, whereas, even subconsciously, many educators and early childhood education services still privilege the experiences and knowledge of specific groups, such as white families from a mid to high socioeconomic status who speak English as their first language over others, such as families of color, families that come from lower socioeconomic statuses, or families who speak English as an additional language, speak limited English, or don't speak English at all. Postmodern theory believes that children's learning should always be constructed and guided by children's prior experiences and knowledge, and that experiences that differ from the norm are no less important to be understood, acknowledged, and respected. Some theories that believe in similar concepts are feminist and post-structuralist theories and perspectives. Feminist and post-structuralist theories believe that, as learning is socially constructed and therefore differs based on the many contexts someone is learning in, there is no such thing as universal truths, laws, and principles that can be applied to all children's learning. These modern theories align with the early years learning framework's principle that we chose for this assignment, the principle of respect for diversity, as the theories believe that all experiences and knowledge are equally valuable and deserving of respect. Another framework that these theories align with is the Victorian Early Years Learning and Development Framework. They align with the practice principle of equity and diversity, which states that children's learning and well-being is supported when their unique identities are acknowledged and respected, as the theories believe that educators should incorporate children's individual experiences and knowledge into their learning to best support and further their learning and development. Modern views and understandings of diversity have and continue to significantly affect practice in early childhood education. One such example of this is the understanding of how culture and cultural experiences and knowledge impact all aspects of children's lives. Over time, more and more research is being done on how culture is formed and experienced on an individual level, including in young children. Researchers, policymakers, and educators alike are now understanding that culture is a complex concept that stems from many sources and that it also affects how children learn and develop. This research into cultural experiences on the individual level is important, as although many experiences of a certain culture may be quite similar, they can still have marked differences that could impact children's learning in many different ways. Many people, educators or not, assume that if they have a general understanding of the main experience of a certain culture, they know the cultural experience of all people within that culture. However, this ignores that many cultures have different groups within them that have different cultural experiences and beliefs, or the fact that many people interact with their cultures at different levels, be it constantly or only on certain occasions. One way that this understanding is impacting and affecting practice in early childhood education is that many educators are changing or modifying their pedagogies to introduce new ways of experiencing and thinking about the world that build upon children's existing cultural experiences and resources instead of replacing them. This practice, also commonly referred to as culturally responsive pedagogy, requires educators to communicate openly and frequently with families. It requires educators to ask about and listen to families' beliefs, values, and experiences, and to implement this knowledge into their children's learning. It also requires ongoing communication and collaboration with families to ensure that all implemented practices for the individual children are effective or how they could be improved going forward. Now, we will compare Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory and postmodern theory in more detail.
Thank you, Lisa. As noted by Arthur et al. In 2021, older theories focus on broader overarching themes and how these themes eventually trickle down and affect the child. Modern theories, on the other hand, have a tendency to focus upon specific aspects of development and often compare direct actions that influence on development. Unlike constructivism, which can be definitively said having evolved from Piaget's cognitive developmental theory, ecological theory and postmodernism do not share that same historical background. However, the ideas behind these theories about the importance of how social contexts impact upon development is central to both. In the case of Bronfenbrenner's proposed ecological theory focuses upon how many different circles and how they interact with one another and therefore impact the child. Postmodern theories, on the other hand, specifically focus upon the societal values that a person is assimilated by. In postmodern views, childhood and development as a whole is socially constructed by factors such as family and culture, and it is important that we acknowledge these factors as they majorly impact how we perceive the child and how the child perceives us. In other terms, ecological theory focuses on how different environments in a child's life interact and impact the child, while postmodernism focuses on how specifically social contexts influence a child's development. Contemporary postmodernism perspective encourages children and educators to embrace the uncertainties and complexities of the modern world and implore educators to not shy away from these challenges. Postmodernism is about challenging the ideas imposed of what a child should be and shifting our practice and mindset to respond to who they are as an individual while being mindful of the contexts that have developed this. The idea of the universal child does not exist in both postmodern theories and ecological theories, as realities are constructed through an individual's social environment. These are all individually developed and depend on how the child has grown up. Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory can be used as a tool to develop an initial understanding of the child and helps us as educators to bridge the gap between classroom and the child's home life. Understanding and implementing postmodern views in kindergarten allows us as educators to develop a richer and more meaningful relationship with the child as a child values as a child. As part of ECR's Code of Ethics, we as educators are highly encouraged to learn about local community contexts and aspirations in order to create responsive programs to enhance children's learning, development, and well-being. We are also highly encouraged to learn about respect and respond to the uniqueness of each family, their circumstances, culture, family structure, customs, language, beliefs, and kinship systems. By understanding both of these theories and how they interact and differ from one another, we create opportunities for these two to occur. One major shift between the 1970s, when Bronfenbrenner initially published his theory, and the 21st century is the decline in strict societal roles and hierarchical systems. Postmodern theories encourage the idea of the deconstruction of rigid systems. As noted by Hertler et al. In 2018, within Bronfenbrenner's theory, there is an existing hierarchical system of how outer circles impact the child. The child does not have much agency in the theory and is a recipient of information rather than an active participant. Postmodernism in educational settings is about deconstructing traditional top-down power structures and replacing these rigid hierarchies with collaborative, pluralistic learning environments. Postmodernist values that young children should take a role in constructing their environments along with their peers, educators, and families. This can be practiced through child-led group activities like nature walks, imaginative role-play. Another notable shift which informs our practice as educators is an increase in culturally diverse ethnic groups and how we have learned to embrace these diverse groups. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics in the 2025 report, 32% of our population were born outside of Australia, and it naturally makes sense that these groups come with their own sets of values and interpretation of their own culture. Therefore, it is important that we recognize and value these differences, even if they differ from our own, so that our practice is appropriate and meaningful for both parents and their families. In regard to the principle of respect and diversity, our teachings as educators should reflect this respect for diversity. Both of the chosen theories connect to the chosen principle of respect for diversity in very similar ways, which is why we have chosen to focus on them as they closely link towards our future practices. When we recognize that all children come from their own background through practices like including various holidays like Diwali and Lunar New Year, we show respect for the culture and children feel more included within the learning environment. When we are open to learning about the child's backgrounds and help to bridge the distance between a child's home life and the life of kindred, we develop a truly with the child and their parents. The main difference between Bronfenbrenner and contemporary learning, as previously told by Kim, is that Bronfenbrenner explains how cultural context influence development, while contemporary theory, like postmodernism, place greater emphasis on actively promoting inclusion, equity, and social justice. We have now come to the conclusion of our presentation. Both Bronfenbrenner's ecological model and postmodern theories center the idea that development is socially constructed, and our social context is a large determinant of development. The social context is informed by factors such as family, cultural background, and ethnicity. Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory focuses on how different environments in a child's life interact and then impact the child, while postmodernism focuses on how specifically social contexts influence a child's development. In regards for respect to diversity, it is vital that we recognize that everyone comes from their own social background and that our practice reflects this by involving other cultures, acknowledging their ways of learning so that we can positively impact the child's education. It is critical that we use both of these models to inform our practices so that we can become informed educators and that we can continue to positively impact the classroom environment.